The following episode of The Imperfects contains discussions and descriptions of various accounts of child sexual abuse, including rape. It also includes discussions of disordered eating. If these are topics that you don't think you can engage with right now, then we recommend skipping it for the moment, but please do come back when you feel you're ready.
What would you tell your adolescent self? I think the first thing that springs to mind is it's not your fault.
Oof.
Yeah. It's not your fault. What happened to you was deliberate, as hard as that is to accept, and there's nothing that you could have done differently.
The Imperfects invites you into a very safe place. A place where we share without judgment and drink heaps of vulnerability. Grab yourself a cup. This is the Vulnerability House.
It sure is the Vulnerability House, and we are so excited to announce that it is officially Grace Tame Day today.
I genuinely can't believe, Grace, that you're here. It is a real honour and a privilege that you would be happy to come on this show. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Genuinely.
The privilege is all mine. I'm really excited to be here.
I'm going to insist that the privilege is all mine.
I don't want to fight with you.
It seems early for us to have a fight. But just to be clear, the privilege is all mine.
Okay.
I mean, I feel like everyone here listening is, yeah, I know Grace, but there is so much to you. You do so much, and you do so much so well. So I'm just going to, I've made dot points.
That's enough.
Okay. That's the bio.
Maybe a few specifics.
So for anyone that doesn't know Grace, she does a lot.
Yeah. And does it very well.
Yeah.
Let me read out a
To block
few
my
things.
ears.
Okay. So here's just a few things that make Grace the person that she is. And I noticed as I was writing down these dot points, I had bracketed comments after the comment for the first 5, and then I just decided to keep going with brackets. So I'll read out the brackets as well, because they do get less and less.
Behind the scenes on the dot point creation.
So Grace is Australian of the Year in 2021. In brackets, I wrote, best acceptance speech of any award ever. On my brackets. A writer, and in brackets, a stunning way with words. If you haven't read the book, it's The Ninth Life of a Diamond Miner. An artist, in brackets, if you want evidence of this, just Google the front cover of her book. She drew that drawing. It is unbelievable. A runner, and then in brackets, and please don't confuse that with my paltry 400 metres. She's an ultra marathon runner. Oh, and then I wrote, how are her shins, ? I was just interested how your shins are.
My shins are quite good.
Okay.
Yeah. I have a good shoe rotation.
Oh,
And especially for longer Ks, you want something that's responsive, that's got good cushioning. And that really helps take a lot of the shock away. It's absorbed in the cushioning of the shoe.
let's talk about that for an hour after the podcast.
Yeah.
I'm glad you said after the podcast at the end of that sentence.
Next point I wrote, Grace is a sexual abuse survivor. And in brackets I wrote, former survivor in silence, but now a survivor with magnificent volume. As a direct result of her trauma, Grace has experienced disordered eating in anorexia. And in brackets, I did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 love hearts. Grace is a yoga instructor. And then my brackets, there's a personal one. Anyway, ask Grace if she conducts one-on-one classes, as I'm keen. That was not to be read out, but I did.
How much of your iPad are you going to read? And then 9 a.m. tomorrow morning, I have a doctor's appointment. Oh, God, I need to update my Gmail.
Grace received an autism diagnosis age 19. And in brackets, I wrote, she sees this neither as a superpower nor is it less than, it's just simply different. Grace was named as the next generation leader by the Time magazine in 2022. In brackets, I wrote, cool.
Good bracket.
This is where I really feel like I just had to finish off with brackets, so they're not as important.
That feels like a forced bracket.
They all are from here. 2 more points. Has a foundation in her own name that continues her advocacy work to end child abuse, in brackets, wow. And then the last one, despite her trauma, Grace has a profound sense of optimism and hope about the world. In brackets, yay.
And that's the podcast.
Wow.
That's all we have time for.
That's the story.
Just the bio.
Just to be clear, Hugh won't bracket after everything you say.
Brackets. Technically, they're called parentheses, but I was. We'll have that.
worth saying.
Unless you were actually using the brackets.
Oh, parentheses being curved
The
brackets.
curved. Those are parentheses. Brackets
Which one's the brackets? Oh, with
Squared brackets.
the harder edges,
which one did
right
you
angle
use?
edges.
I have been rightly corrected.
Yeah, I didn't know that either. That's interesting.
So what are the ones that have the curls in the middle? Like,
Oh, good question.
it's got like, it goes...
Bird face with the beak.
Yeah.
I always think of them as like the brackets from the Renaissance period.
Yeah.
Oh yes, I like that.
Yeah.
Baroque brackets.
Baroquets.
Brackets.
Brackets. That is exactly what they are.
I'm just pitching if there's anyone out there who is thinking, I hope they talk about brackets with Grace Tame today. They will be so happy right now.
Yeah, whoever's doing the next interview is probably thinking, damn, they covered baroquets. Thought I was going to get to that first. Now, this, as we all know, this is a vulnerability house. Unless Hugh, there's any more baroquets you want to...
No more brackets. No more parentheses I need to.
Okay, good. So it's a vulnerability house. So for those who haven't heard before, we have a deck of cards on the table, which on each card there's a question, which, if Grace picks 3, then one of them might invoke some form of vulnerability. And Hugh, why is vulnerability so important? Why do we do this?
So vulnerability is when you take an emotional risk when the outcome is uncertain. And so often, certainly in my life, that leads to authentic connection. And authentic connection, in my experience, when I look back on my life, the happiest moments have been when I've been authentically connected to the people around me and the world around me. So that's why we do this.
Yeah, it's the whole meaning of life, right?
Yeah.
To share experiential souvenirs with each other.
Oh, experiential souvenirs is great.
It's much better than
I
what I
used
just
that
said.
phrase in my prologue of my book.
Grace, even if you speak through the side of your mouth, we can still hear you.
That was my bird bracket.
Excellent. It's like there's another character that comes out,
There's a few.
the self-promotional character.
Because I can't seriously self-promote.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes
Just
sense.
Grace Untamed.
Grace Untamed. That's good. So yes, back to the cards. So there are these cards, Grace, and so how it works is you'll pick 3 cards, and if any of those 3 cards speak to you in any way and you feel comfortable answering them, that would be great. And if none of them do, you can just keep picking cards until one feels right, and then just see what comes out.
Nothing.
Yeah, okay. Grace just listened to one, which they don't work like that yet.
Didn't speak to me.
Yeah, it didn't speak. That's fair. No, that's fair.
I'll go back to this first one.
Okay.
I'll give it a second chance.
Okay.
I didn't actually read it. Whew. These aren't Cards Against Humanity cards, damn.
Yeah.
What would you tell your adolescent self? I think the first thing that springs to mind is it's not your fault.
Oof.
Yeah. It's not your fault. What happened to you was deliberate, as hard as that is to accept, and there's nothing that you could have done differently. I need some tea.
What does it feel like when you think about your adolescent self? When you think about yourself back then, how do you feel?
I've worked hard to find a sense of compassion for myself at that age. So many of the things that you go through in adolescence, you don't have any other frame of reference for, but you have this paradoxical experience of thinking that you do know everything, and you can only identify that in hindsight in adulthood when you've had enough experiences to recontextualize things at that distance, that time that's necessary to reflect.
Absolutely.
When you say it's not your fault, did you feel like it was your fault back then? Did you feel...
I mean, it's definitely, it's such a huge part of the grooming mechanism is to convince children that they are complicit in their own abuse and that they are willing participants, as is often the line used, and that there is, well, let me put it like this. Child sex offenders, generally speaking, child sexual abuse covers a really broad spectrum. On the one hand, you've got child sex offenders who are just people who want to look at, naked kids running around, and they would actually be really disturbed by some things that other child sex offenders do. And then towards the other end of the spectrum, you have your recidivist, in some cases psychopathic criminals who are very Machiavellian, very manipulative, and as part of that, very charming. And they, especially those who are skilled, who have perpetrated crimes against many victims, they develop a skill set that includes ways to convince not just the victim but essentially everyone around them in the criminal's network, in the victim's network, that they are a good person, and they coerce the child victims into believing this narrative that they are loved and cared for by the perpetrator. And so in response to that, especially as a child, you do naturally attach. I mean, that's the point of what we were talking about before, connections, attachments, those are integral, inherent parts of life. And so you do feel, as the child victim, you're made to feel special. You feel like you belong, perhaps somewhere where you didn't feel like you belonged. So there's an attachment that forms, as perverted as it sounds. And grooming really is a perverted system of punishment and reward, right? You think about it like that. You are rewarded for certain expressions that align with the needs of the perpetrator or the desires of the perpetrator. And then you're punished, maybe not in an obvious way. Sometimes physical violence might be used, but generally it would be some kind of psychological torture, withholding love or withholding attention or affection. So you're punished, and then you learn how to respond to that in the safest way possible.
You talked about connection, and of course connection is it is crucial for all of us. To that is how we survive, really.
Yeah.
How has that experience affected your way to connect with people, if at all?
I was already pretty dysregulated. So, to give a bit of context, my parents divorced when I was 2 years old. I don't actually have any memories of them together as a family unit. They both love me a lot. But my childhood was very disrupted by the going back and forth between two homes. So it was physically disruptive, but also psychologically, because there were two very different dynamics that I was having to navigate. I spent 3 days in one, then 4 days in another, and did that all through my childhood, essentially almost up until I moved out of home at age 18 and left the country, as well as autism, which neurodivergence, different neurotype to the predominant neurotype, so navigating that as well. Some of the groundwork was already done for this perpetrator, and we now know through extensive research that recidivist child sex offenders often pick children specifically, all children are vulnerable, obviously, but they'll pick children with added vulnerabilities like an unstable home life, mental illness, social difficulties. They might pick marginalised children, or children that are already isolated for whatever reason in out-of-home care or something like that, because it makes it easier for this regime of control to be established and run.
It's so devastating to hear that. Just to hear that there is such I guess a conscious targeting of extra vulnerable children?
It's part of the problem, I think, when we're talking about child sexual abuse and prevention and intervention and response measures, is that we don't have a full picture of just how dark it is. I think we all understand that child molestation, child rape are bad, but and in ways the media is limited with what they can cover. Some of the things that I hear, the cases that I hear, whether it's of child sexual abuse or child sexual abuse material that's traded heavily online, the content is far more sadistic and far more, I suppose, evil than the general public are aware.
Was there a specific age when you went back just then and to when the other question was adolescent self? I'm interested to know what stage of the whole process you were in your mind when you were talking to yourself then, when you had a mess. Was it before it began? Was it during? Was it after?
Well, I mean, it depends on what experience I'm referring to. There were things that happened in my childhood before I encountered this particular child sex offender. For example, I mean, I was abused as a young child at 6 years old first by an older child. And, I feel like all of us as children we just see a lot of stuff. It's not necessarily traumatic, but, life is hard for a child. Navigating a new world that's completely foreign to them. But I think the experience of being really sadistically abused at age 15 is like during that time, certainly, and after. I think that's where my mind went.
So at that time in your life, did you have a sense that this is wrong? Did you have that clarity on what was going on? Did you think this is not right, or is the experience of being groomed too overwhelming to be able to see clearly like that?
Yeah, so it is intoxicating and it is terrifying. I think, many things are happening at once. You're really running on adrenaline. Fear is sort of the main driver. I had a definite sense that it was wrong, but also just you're completely isolated and you feel trapped. You feel like you can't explain because so much of it is so complicated. You feel like you can't explain it. And also some of it is just frankly unbelievable, to learn in such a jarring way that there are people who are not just capable of doing certain things but willing to repeatedly. That's where you sort of just learn to actually in those times suppress your needs. They take a backseat and you just are living sort of moment to moment, doing what you can to get through to the next moment if you can.
So you're sort of like in survival mode.
You're entirely in survival mode. I mean, even when victims are abused in front of each other, for example, as children, the protective denial that you sort of intuitively enter into is so strong that these victims, again, who are abused in front of other victims, will, they'll deny that happened. It's a sort of a form of, and like, again, like the more extreme cases you see of child sexual abuse, there tends to be, higher levels of dissociation, because that's the only way that you can cope with a lot of that stuff is just to completely separate yourself. Like my body learned very quickly to separate itself physically from the pain of the penetration, because it was just so painful. And actually I experienced such physical dissociation that I would feel pain in the years afterwards. And it wasn't until I was about 19 and started doing yoga again after years off that I could identify local regions of pain. I just felt global pain. And that was my body's way of going, just tap out, like you can't deal with this. And that's also why it took me so long to get a diagnosis of endometriosis because I just associated all this pelvic pain with that time. But yeah, like, you know, I can't give any more detail, but there were other children present at the time of the abuse of me, for example, and it's only been in the last few years that, you know, that we've come together and revisited some of that. You know, there were whole parts of the experience that I just shut down on because I wasn't ready to go there.
How was that? I mean, yeah, when you say you sort of, I guess, maybe erased from your memory or not even consciously, it's just they were not there.
You unconsciously suppress them.
Yeah. And so then meeting up with this other person how challenging was that?
Well, I think, you know, for both of us, it's really hard. I think in a way, you know, you're good at protecting yourself, but it's that knowing that somebody else was harmed that's actually hard for me personally to cope with.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I've also since met previous victims of this man, dating back to the early 90s before I was born.
Oh my God.
So, you know, and one of them looks like me. That was really hard as well. It was another sort of layer of like, whoa, okay.
So when you were saying before it's not your fault, were you also thinking about the other people as well?
Definitely, yeah. It's never a child's fault.
Yeah.
I mean, to give you an example, the perpetrator who abused me was grooming me for a number of months and there was no contact offending. And I was going home and telling my father and my mother that I was having long conversations with this man because I didn't see that there was anything wrong with that as a child. And my parents actually had 2 meetings with the school to request that he stay away from me. And still after those meetings, he actually persisted and he waited for an opportunity to strike. So there were maybe 6 weeks that went by between these meetings and a weekend rehearsal that I attended for a school play. And suddenly he turned up to campus. And the teachers who were directing the school play had no knowledge of the requests for him to be kept separate from me. So he, you know, this is what I'm saying. Like that.
Yeah. Were you aware at the time that those conversations were happening?
Yeah, I was actually part of one of them. I was instructed the day after my baby brother was born in 2010, a day after, and I had just been in hospital as well for treatment for a relapse of anorexia. I remember sitting in the principal's office and I feel like it was quite strategic looking back on it that he was sitting next to her, a woman who he openly despised, and they were kind of both looking at me as if I was this very troubled, mentally ill young girl who had caused this situation, and that's certainly how I felt. And it is true that I was troubled and was struggling with mental health issues. But I look back on that and the word gaslighting was certainly not in the vernacular, my vernacular. It wasn't in the zeitgeist at that time. But if I could, use that word to describe anything, it would be that moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Can I ask you about loneliness?
Yeah, you can.
Yeah.
I'm no stranger to loneliness for sure.
I was just, because the whole time you've been talking about that adolescent child version of yourself and then the journey to be able to say it's not your fault, it must have been so lonely for so long.
It was incredibly lonely. I think, many things can be true at once. I look back on my childhood and I think in so many ways I was really lucky to come from a very tight-knit family, particularly on my mother's side. There's 12 of us cousins, I think now, or 11 of us cousins. 8 of us are girls, but all of us are really close. And my best friend Dom, who I've known since we were 7 years old, who's also autistic, who just understands me implicitly, and his family, who I spent a lot of time with. I had those really strong foundational connections. But at the same time, I was incredibly lonely. I didn't know that I was autistic. I definitely, outside of my family and the connections that I had with Dom and his family, I felt very misunderstood. And I think that is something that the perpetrator who abused me was aware of. I was in his class in year 9. The physical abuse began in year 10, but I was in his class in year 9. And that was in some ways the height of my loneliness and, difficulty navigating teenage years. I was hospitalized for 6 weeks. That was a really lonely period. I was able to have visitors, and I did have good friends, but things like anorexia are very alienating as well. And certainly I felt very far away from everybody else internally for long periods of my life.
How do you feel now with respect to loneliness?
Well, there's a difference. Was it Billy Joel who said there's a difference between loneliness and being alone? I don't mind being alone.
Yeah.
And I do feel, because human connection is just one avenue of connection. Connection with the environment, connection with animals, connection with activities that we like to do. I've found a lot of solace, a lot of comfort, and authentic connection in those places. Like, I love going out in nature. I love to swim in the ocean. There are a few things more grounding than that. I love to make art, love to run, and that's a really connective activity.
Yeah. When you're in the midst of being groomed and you've also had anorexia to deal with, those forms of connection that you're talking about there, are they just non-existent? Like connections with things you love? Like, as we've discussed, you're a brilliant artist, you're a runner, you've got so many facets to what make up the wonderful person you are. Where do they go during that?
They sort of fall by the wayside. My experience of anorexia, which really is tied to autism as well, and I didn't, learn until very recently that there's such a thing as autistic restrictive food intake disorder, which is certainly, I think, what I struggled with, because it wasn't necessarily that I didn't want to eat. It's that I didn't want to eat certain things because I'm averse to certain textures. I prefer others. I prefer to eat cleanly. I certainly am very sensitive to whatever I put in my body, and not just because of endometriosis. So when I feel sick, I don't want to, if I can avoid feeling sick, of course, all of us will do that.
Yeah.
But my experience of anorexia certainly overlapped with the experience of grooming. I believe that this perpetrator weaponized the eating disorder that I had against me and to his advantage. He knew full well that I had taken time off school because I was absent for 6 weeks in his class, and there were only 8 or 9 of us students altogether, so it leaves quite a big mark. And also when he began overtly grooming me in 2010, that was around the time that I was relapsing, he attempted to visit me while I was in hospital and posed as my uncle. And asked me lots of questions about my family background and the troubles that I had. And, in the beginning, he was putting me up on a pedestal and celebrating all of the things that I like to engage in. Like, he saw my drawings and told me that I should have my own art exhibition and, was really pumping my tires up, so to speak. But later on down the track, as this regime of control really sort of enveloped me entirely, and I was really isolated from my friends and family, and the contact offending had begun, any time that I appeared to resist him, or that he saw through the sort of mask of comfort that I tried really hard to put up to please him, I definitely fawned, and that was my protective mechanism, my survival mechanism that I learnt from past traumas. Whenever he saw that I might not like what was going on or how he was treating me, he would take me down a peg by making a comment about my appearance. I distinctly remember, I was naked standing behind his office, wooden desk like this, and I asked him if he thought I was overweight, and he just looked me up and down and said, "Oh, you could do with some more exercise." And like, it was that coldness that, and like, there are other examples. I remember him getting very frustrated the first time that he tried to penetrate me, and he did not succeed because like my vagina froze up, and he tried plying me with alcohol as well. And he just got so frustrated that he ended up just dropping me on the side of the road a couple of blocks away, and it was like, dark on a Friday night, and I was a 15-year-old, and I was just legless. Had to make my way into the cinema around the corner and was stumbling around. And my cousin had arranged to be there to meet me. But it's just like stuff like that where you learn pretty quickly that your safety is not a priority for that person, and you do anything that you can to survive.
That is harrowing.
It's so harrowing, and I find it quite incredible that you're able, and you have chosen for good reason and understandably, to continue to talk about it. And I think one of the most incredible things is the fact that you're choosing to sort of retrace these steps and like talk about these times, which is just so traumatic. But it's so important because, like you said, like the details that you're not even going into all the details, but we're so shielded as a society from the details of what actually happens. And I guess a lot of it is, I guess there are, you can't talk about certain things on television or write it in a newspaper. But while it's really, really hard to hear, obviously, it should not be an excuse for the fact that we all need to know this. We all need to know what is going on.
Well, you can't deal with a problem until you face it.
Yep.
Unless you fully face a problem, you can't hope to solve it. And I don't think we're quite there yet. I don't think we're quite prepared to actually listen to. That's one part, but then accept the reality of this type of crime.
Yeah. Because as you paint the picture of yourself behind the desk, my first thought was that is so shocking and awful. But then also straight away my brain went, what do you expect was happening? Like, what did you, I hadn't even let my brain go to that. I've heard what's happened to you, I know what's happened to you, but I didn't allow my own brain to even go to picturing what that would look like for you. And I think,
because you hear the top line stuff.
Yeah.
You got to remember this was every day for over 6 months, and every day there's a different lot of experiences.
I mean, that image of you making your way from the car is the most heartbreaking thing I've ever heard.
I mean, I also kind of think like, there are sometimes when we have people on this podcast and they'll share their story, and it sometimes is, often it's quite a traumatic experience that they're talking about. And, and so then we think about it, and it's like, we don't just stop thinking about it when we walk away from the thing.
No.
But you're even though you've been through such traumatic experiences, you're also, in the work that you're doing, you're hearing so many stories. I mean, how do you deal with that on such a regular basis?
Sometimes you don't, if I'm being honest and vulnerable. It's never an easy thing to hear that somebody else has been harmed. And so I never stop being shocked by the disclosures that come my way. But I've done a lot of work on creating essentially boundaries, even though we're talking conversationally, they tend to be kind of abstract things, and you do actually absorb, like vicarious trauma is a very real thing, and you do absorb it at the cellular level. That's what sort of the nature of trauma is. And it's actually, they've done research that supports this theory that it is much easier actually to expunge trauma, to speak about it, than it is to ingest it. So hearing about things can be really difficult. Like it's not often until I read other child sexual abuse survivors' experiences that in many ways will parallel my own that I will feel
Find yourself reliving. So,
find myself really distressed. But I call services. I'm a regular caller of Lifeline. I call them up and, I might be having an autistic shutdown where my language systems are all discombobulated and I can't necessarily articulate my feelings very well, but I will do my best to just give a little bit of context like I'm autistic, I'm having a shutdown, or I work in a traumatic field, of having flashbacks of child sexual abuse or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I lean on those services that are there. Like I practice what I preach when I address large audiences and I'm asked questions about, how do you cope? I recommend those services because they're there for a reason and they're professional. And sometimes you do want to be able to speak to your friends about it and you do want to be able to speak to your family about it. But you've got to be really careful because they then are more likely to take on that traumatic experience because they feel connected to you. And that love makes it extra difficult to process. So
what is it like? I mean, we always recommend people to every episode. I think we recommend people to call Lifeline if they need to. I've never called Lifeline, but hearing you say that, it makes me think like, oh, maybe like I'd like to know what that experience is like calling Lifeline. Well,
the counsellors are professionally trained to do this job. They invariably speak with a very soothing voice. Sometimes there's a little the little skeptic inside my head's like, oh, stop patronising me, like thinking like this. But then at the same time, I'm like, no, it's nice. It's actually what I need. And it's different every time because you're speaking to a different individual every time, and that's nice. It's a comfort, but it's like anything. You kind of have to flex the muscle and you have to get, used to doing it. I don't call them all the time, but over the last 3 years, I've definitely called them quite a lot.
Wow.
I think a barrier for many people is that, and again, this comes back to that, that internal shame dialogue of, oh, my experience or my feelings right now are not bad enough to warrant calling this service. Even if, I'll be on the floor sometimes completely overwhelmed by emotion and often experience alexithymia, which is a common autistic experience of just this coalescent emotion that you can't distinguish between. And
is that when you can't express as well? So
you don't quite understand what the emotion is, but it's just experienced as almost a bodily. Well, it is. It's like a bodily sense of overwhelm, where you're physically overtaken by it, and I might feel pain, acute pain, as well as distress, and I'll be on the floor, but I'll still be thinking, oh, it's not the end of the world. Like there's somebody in a worse position than me. You got to remember there's several Lifeline counsellors. There's also the option to text them if you feel like you actually are unable to express yourself verbally. There's, I don't know.
Yeah.
But that certainly I think is a barrier for a lot of people is like, oh, my trauma's not as important.
Definitely.
My situation's not as important.
It's an interesting sentiment, that one. They're like that sentiment of like there's someone doing it tougher than me, because I feel like it's a complex one.
There's someone doing it tougher than you until there isn't.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really well said.
Wow, that is really well said. That is so true.
I've got two things in my head I want to talk about. One is the experience of autism through all this. The other is you and I chatted on the phone last week and we talked about running because we both love it, but also it was a conversation that went around, is it a healthy obsession for you? And what it actually does, the more deeply you think about it, what purpose do you hope that it serves, and is it serving that purpose, I guess, is the question. So
Which one do you want me to
Yeah,
address
I'll just give you
first?
2 questions.
Experience of autism through the years. And that's one book. Okay.
Can we go
Running.
with running? Can we go with running? Because that.
Yeah, we can start with running. Because it actually dovetails nicely from what you were asking me before about do all of those things that you love to engage in, you know, when you're experiencing something like anorexia and grooming, do they fall by the wayside?
Yeah.
And any like experience that we have, I think, in life or anything that we're connected with, the relationship will ebb and flow depending on so many different variables. Certainly, I liked to run as a kid. I seemed to be naturally good at it. And my mum was a good long-distance runner. My dad's a great sportsman. He's not hugely keen on long-distance running, but he's really stubborn. And I think the combination of those genes of stubbornness and endurance served me well. And I just seemed to be, you know, I was petite, I was full of beans, and I have a really strong sense of adventure. I mean, Mum recalls when I was an infant and before I'd even learnt how to walk, I discovered that I could pull myself up in my cot and open the curtains and look out the window. And I've always retained that, I think. There's certainly been times in my life after, you know, in the aftermath of some of the heavier traumas, I've engaged in maladaptive coping mechanisms like drinking alcohol, too much alcohol, abusing prescription drugs, illicit drugs, and just generally speaking, not living healthily, not exercising. Because, you know, especially when you have a really perverted experience like grooming where everything's sort of inverted, like the things that you love to do, you end up not being able to engage in, or you develop a negative association with, and then the things that cause you discomfort, like, you know, whether it's sexual abuse or something, or the sexual touch, you learn to associate that with safety, oddly, because the perpetrator is pleased. Like you get this really weird, these really weird associations that you start to form.
Yeah.
I'm thankful that I had a sort of a foundation of connections to return to.
Yeah, that had developed prior to.
And running was certainly one of those, because I lost, and I wasn't even aware of this until my mother confronted me about it. But I lost my interest in running very much at that time of being 15 years old. The day that this perpetrator did actually succeed in penetrating me was the day of the high school athletics carnival in 2010. I was in my running uniform. In fact, I still had my rugby jumper on, and I was just on my back on the floor. And I just remember this man laughing. I could see his teeth, just laughing and talking about how much cellulite he could see on the legs of the girls running up at the track. And he forced his way into me and just said, "Oh, I didn't think we would get that far." And running, just, I never thought about it consciously, but I just threw it away, and had this really dark connection to it. And it wasn't until I was about 23, so nearly 8 years later, that a friend of mine in Los Angeles, because I moved to the United States when I was 18 to get out of the one paper town, rumour mill, just really insular environment, and start afresh with some anonymity. But I remember my friend in Los Angeles, he and I were doing workouts twice a week, and then one day he suggested that we go for a run as a way of warming up. And I just naturally fell back into it and started running again. But there I was creating a new relationship with it because it was positive. And then to sort of answer your question about that unhealthy relationship, anything I think can become unhealthy if you, well, it also depends on what's going on in your life outside of that as well. And I feel like things like running or whatever, you know, or say it's your work, they start to reflect other parts of your life. So my running journey at that particular time mirrored the rest of my life, which was again becoming unstable. So with the advent of the Let Her Speak campaign, which was really towards the end of 2018 and into 2019, I was restricting my diet again, and I was running too far because I was really facing this trauma, and there was a public element to that, you know, sharing the story for the purpose of driving this reform. And what was happening, and again, it was my mother who confronted me about this possibility, and she was right, was that I was trying to get my child body back, and running gave me that. Because I didn't want to be a woman. I didn't want to be looked at in the way that I had been looked at. And I wanted my body that had not been violated.
Gosh.
And I couldn't get that back.
Wow.
You know, and I didn't want to have a period. You know, I had associated menstruation as well with abuse, you know, because this particularly sadistic man liked when I was bleeding because it meant he didn't have to wear a condom. And so I did not want to see that. I didn't want to participate in any of that. I wanted to stay young, and I couldn't.
It's so heartbreaking. I just wonder, how do you, particularly when you started telling that story in like 2019 and you started telling it publicly like you do, no doubt it's always difficult to tell the story, and I can see that it is now, like, to tell that story. But how do you feel? How did you feel when you first told that story publicly? The first time when you shared what happened to you, like, how did you feel when you shared that?
It's a really difficult question to answer because in many ways I wasn't in my right mind. But most things in my life have just happened like that, where, you know, I have been in survival mode for a really long time. I mean, I think back on the start of the Let Her Speak campaign, and when the journalist Nina Fennell got in touch with first my mother, because she was sharing a campus along with many other students, but also the then twice convicted child sex offender who abused me. He was given a PhD scholarship to study at the University of Tasmania and put into student accommodation with 18-year-old undergraduates that had shared shower facilities. And my mum was at the University of Tasmania. This is how the campaign actually started. She was at the University of Tasmania. I was still living overseas. And this journalist got in touch with my mother because it was my mother who was taking on the university and insisting that this perpetrator had contravened the student code of conduct, and the university was saying that he hadn't. And there was also a petition that arose out of his presence on campus because a number of people felt unsafe. You know, the question is, would you allow this person to babysit your children? And the answer unequivocally is no. And yet there he was in an environment that he had, you know, proven was the type of environment he would exploit. You know, that's why he'd been to prison. You know, it's not the same thing as just like giving a criminal another chance. He was also already a very well-educated man. But there was this controversy going on in early 2017, and this journalist, Nina Fennell, got in touch with my mother and then realised that there was this whole story of child sexual abuse behind that, which had led up to this moment. And so the journalist then got in touch with me, and I was still living overseas. I was in a violent relationship that was also its own high-intensity environment that you just sort of had to negotiate from moment to moment. So there's always just been that in the background, I think. And maybe I do my disservice by, you know, presenting well. That's something I learned from my father, who's who hoards clothes and always dresses really nicely. But beneath the surface is so much more that we don't see. Yeah, I don't know. How did it feel to tell the story? I think in many ways the story was still unfolding, and I hadn't quite come to terms with the worst aspects of it.
Do you feel like, are you still in survival mode at the moment?
Sometimes I am, but I feel like I've made some really healthy decisions that have allowed me to ground certainly more than I have in the past. But for example, like when any human being is put on television and essentially requested to perform their trauma, and I don't mean make it up, I mean go back into yourself, inhabit that epoch of your life that is really distressing and try to communicate it with others, I think that is, well, just scientifically speaking, that is survival mode.
Yeah.
And I think perhaps people sometimes don't realize that because what they see is the outcome and they don't see all of that context of that. In order to do that, what you're having to put yourself through is extreme.
I think a lot of people would also want to believe that you're capable, like that. I think because everyone who sees you is so in awe of how remarkable a human being you are. I think people
Except
would
for
want
the
to
people
believe.
at Sky News.
Of course, there are some dickheads. Yeah, sorry, that's true. A lot of people, the vast majority of people, I think, wouldn't want to be confronted with how difficult it is because it's easier to not admit to how challenging this must be for other people to say, look how impressive she is. She's got it all together and she can do this. It's amazing. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but it's important for me to communicate to people the reality
I'm glad you are.
of it because it is really hard. And I think the reason I was able to cope, for example, with the experience of being Australian of the Year, as well as I did, and at times I really struggled behind closed doors, and I'm lucky that I have a really strong family who were there to support me, as well as Max, who gave every inch of himself to support me as well. I think I took to that really well because I was used to being exploited and I was very accustomed to instability. And that's the truth. I wouldn't recommend this trajectory. I think advocacy is really important, but the magnification of it and the level of scrutiny that I have experienced is not something that is actually necessary. You don't have to go through that to be an advocate. And so I do sort of warn people, like, you say you want this and you say you want this level of exposure, I wouldn't recommend it. Because there's all these other things that come along with that package deal that you might not necessarily be aware of.
It's a huge sacrifice, I think, and people do not think at all about the repercussions of being famous. And
I wouldn't even call myself famous. Like, I don't think like that. Like,
no, I know, because I think because you're not seeking it out. You're not seeking out the fame. But I think it's such a good point. It's if being known in any way outside of the people who should know you can be very, very scary and really, really dangerous to your own well-being.
Yeah, and your own sense of self.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you're not aware of that, and sort of taking active steps to stay connected to present and to authentic relationships.
Yeah. So you mentioned endometriosis, which you are dealing with at the moment.
Yeah, late stage endometriosis.
So how can you please talk to us about that? Like, that's not something we hear a whole lot about publicly, like anywhere. And I know a friend of mine had an operation to help her endometriosis. Do you mind talking about your experience with it and how it's affected
Sure.
you? Yeah.
So for people playing the home game, we should probably explain what endometriosis is.
Yes.
If they don't know. It's where growths similar to the lining of your uterus grow outside of your uterus. And that can be on other organs. Sometimes you'll have adhesions where the endometrial cysts or growths will burst and then fuse organs together.
Mm-hmm.
It can infiltrate organs. It's quite common for late-stage endometriosis to proliferate through the bowel, for example. I know people who have had endometriosis removed from their lungs and diaphragm. But my experience with endometriosis, I would guess, goes back to actually puberty when I started menstruating. But then because I had years of amenorrhea where I didn't menstruate through anorexia, the symptoms were suppressed. And so the pain, the pelvic pain that I experience now, just chronically, that I've just gotten used to, was not something that I felt during those times. But at the end of 2022, I contracted pneumonia and was like coughing up blood and got really, really sick, sicker than I've ever been in my entire life. It took me about 3 weeks to sort of get back to any kind of normal and start running again. And then I went out for dinner and I had half a glass of wine. That's the last time I've had a drink. It's been nearly 18 months. Half a glass of wine and some foods that I now know are all the foods that will flare endometriosis.
Mm-hmm.
And I had what I thought was food poisoning for 4 days.
What are those foods that flare endometriosis?
Just processed foods,
Okay.
bread,
Mm-hmm.
Dairy,
Mm-hmm.
fried food,
Mm-hmm.
as well as alcohol. Even though it was a small amount, I guess there's no safe amount of poison, technically. And so after that, I had 4 days, as I said, of being so sick. I thought I had food poisoning. Again, got back on my feet, I thought. Then about a week later, I went out, ate similar foods, had what I thought was food poisoning again for 2 days, was projectile vomiting, was just so unwell. Then thought I got better. And in 10 days, I then went out again and got food poisoning again. And this time it was so awful. I was out for nearly 5 days. My friend that I was with at the time was worried that they were going to have to take me to the ER to get me on some fluids because I just couldn't keep anything down. Couldn't keep any water even down. Was really, really sick. And I had this lingering brain fog afterwards as well. I was so fatigued. I just essentially couldn't get better after 2 months straight of, the pneumonia and then what I thought were 3 or 4 bouts of really serious food poisoning. And I went to the doctor. I thought maybe I had a parasite, took the necessary antibiotics to treat a parasite. Nothing changed. And they recommended that I go and get an echocardiogram or transthoracic echocardiogram. Did that. They couldn't see any damage there to my heart. And then finally I bit the bullet after being tested as well for Crohn's and IBS and celiac and having negative results there and nothing really showing up on my bloods that was abnormal. I finally bit the bullet and went to see a gynecologist. That's something I'd been avoiding for over a decade because I just was too traumatized. But I went to see a gynecologist and explained my history, explained my symptoms. They went through a checkbox of symptoms that they then asked me if I experienced, and I ticked every one, and there were like 28 or 30 of them. And I was like, oh, wow, this makes sense. And then they said that I should get an internal ultrasound to see if they could see anything. Because usually in the earlier stages of endometriosis, you might have it, but it won't show up on an MRI or an internal ultrasound. But if you have later stage endometrioma or growths, they'll be able to see those on scans. And so I went and had an internal ultrasound just over 6 months ago, and they found, they found growths, and that made a lot of sense. It was difficult to hear, but also at the same time really validating because I knew that something's really wrong.
I've got a follow-up question I think you're going to have an answer for. I have this hunch because I find, and I'm not sure about groups of women, but I certainly know in groups of men, if someone mentions that someone's got endometriosis, it's sort of like this, oh, okay, cool, and like move on quickly. Like, let's not ask any more questions about that. Why do you think that is?
I think most fear and most discomfort seems to come from the unknown, and there's not enough known about endometriosis.
Yeah.
There's more and more research coming out now, but there certainly hasn't been a lot available, publicly available, until recently.
Yeah.
But that's probably why, and I think as not just as women, but, as human beings, I think we're often we're socialized to internalize different parts of ourselves for the comfort of others. In the case of women, it's often talks of menstruation and, that sort of thing.
Any of the reproductive area.
Any of the reproductive area.
Yeah.
Again, I can't speak to the experience of what it's like to be a man and, broach certain topics and
Yeah. That's true. I probably phrased that question poorly, but I think
no, not at all. Not at all.
Yeah.
Because even amongst women, sometimes I'll share some of my experiences with endometriosis, the symptoms, the pain, or just what's happened that week, and it might involve a flare or something like that. And there's visible discomfort from those women who haven't experienced endometriosis. I think it's again, it's because we don't have this strong understanding of what it is, and it's a new thing, and anything new socially tends to be quite ugly.
A new thing to be talked about, you mean? Like as it's always been there,
a
but
new topic.
A new topic.
Or a new experience in its infancy, in its early days of being
in the vernacular.
shared in the vernacular, often tends to be quite ugly and jarring.
Yeah, that's well said. Yeah. Well, thanks for talking about it here.
Thanks.
It's okay. Thanks.
Throughout your story and a lot of stuff we've talked about today, it feels as though at many points in your life, your body has been manipulated and used against you as a source of great pain. And for someone like myself who has never been through any real trauma like you've described, I have not a great relationship with my body in itself. You spoke so beautifully and emotionally. It was such a poignant and tragic realization that your mum was talking about trying to reclaim the body, the pre-woman body of a child. Where are you at now with a connection with your sort of heart and brain and body as a woman?
That's a really important question because, again, like I explained about running, the relationship is constantly evolving. There are times that I still struggle, and I would put that down to the strength of that cellular imprint of trauma from childhood. And one of the ways that I have healed, not that healing I think is, whatever that is, whatever that looks like, is through speaking with so many other child sexual abuse survivors about their experience, but also reading a lot of research, which again is often taken from real world examples of child sexual abuse. I lean into, the things that my body can help me to do, as opposed to its appearance.
Okay.
And I think, something that's really important to discuss actually about child sexual abuse is that perpetrators of prolonged child sexual abuse are actually deliberately weaponizing the biology of their child victims. The capacity for a child to be sexually aroused, like boys who'll get erections because they're stimulated by physical touch, or, girls who will experience some kind of pleasure from attention. Those things are natural responses to another action. And that is so much a part of the shame that is internalized by children because they reacted in a certain way as their sexuality was developing, and therefore, like I said, weaponized by the perpetrator. That capacity for arousal or the capacity to experience pleasure and things like that. And I think that's where some people can become ashamed of not just their responses psychologically, but their responses physically, and develop that distrust of their own body.
Yeah.
In fact, there was a paper co-written by Professor Mike Salter, who works at the University of New South Wales and is also the chair of the creatively named Tame Foundation.
Named after you?
I believe so.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of thought went into that. But Mike wrote this paper that I believe is titled Betrayed by My Body, and it was about the conflation of consent with arousal, which is really dangerous, especially in the context of prolonged child sexual abuse.
Yeah.
Because like the use of pleasure, both physical and psychological, is such a key component of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, like having to relearn that physically, that my body is something that can be trusted as well, has been difficult, as you said, because in many ways it has been used against me.
Yeah.
There's something I've been thinking about during this, and this feels like the right time to ask. And if it's too personal of a question, then we'll just pretend like it never happened. But how has your experience affected your like intimate relationships now as a adult? Oh no,
I'm just thinking like, how has it not affected my intimate relationships?
Yeah.
On so many levels, rebuilding trust, we're figuring out what trust even is. I have had to work through a lot of pain-based behaviours that certainly intersect with autism as well. At times when I'm overwhelmed, I can completely shut down and dissociate, and that can be interpreted as that I'm disinterested, or that I'm being rude, or that I'm ignoring someone, when actually I'm not even fully present in my own brain. I'm just trying to fight with a really dark internal dialogue that I am perversely trying to actually protect people from. So that's why I'm not engaging with them.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not very good at communicating that. I just sort of go into a shell and do my own little thing. And in terms of the physical intimacy, again, autism, I do really like hugging people personally. However, it has to be on my own terms. And I do the kind of like wrestler tap where I'm like, okay, that's enough. 3-second rule. And part of that is because, again, affection was weaponized in the context of the abuse. I don't want to be trapped. Don't like confined spaces for that reason. Sleep with the door open. Because he like locked me in a cupboard, and I don't like that sort of stuff. And so I don't know, I can be a bit almost like flighty. But yeah, and then like actual physical intimacy itself, for many years after, alcohol was essentially the only way that I would even consider having sex with someone, because I just didn't want to go there. I experienced a lot of pain, and still to this day, I experience an extreme amount of pain, and I'm working through that. And I have like physical flashbacks to that time where my entire body just freezes, and it's like even if I open my eyes, I can't see anything except just replays of this time, and I can't move. So that, to answer your question, it has been a journey. So many ways.
Grace, I mean, thank you so much for sharing that. It just feels like it's such an intimate part of anyone's experience in life, and it's also something like, I know people who have experienced like abuse in different ways, and now they really, really struggle, and I feel like from the little knowledge I have of it, it can be a very kind of like shameful thing, because and this is not talking about you, but this is talking about just the people that I know, because I think in an environment where you're going to have sex, or particularly if it's someone that you don't know very well and it's a new thing, you want to the wrong way to say it, but like you want to be good at it, or you want to make a good impression.
Yeah.
You want to,
You want to be an equal participant. You want to feel confident
Yep.
in what you're doing. I mean,
Yep.
for a really long time, I didn't know what I liked, what gave me pleasure, because my priority was servicing somebody else essentially. And I would find myself in situations where I just would be doing what I thought the other person wanted with no actual concept of like, do I like this? And I just tolerated, in some ways being mistreated again. And it wasn't until I had some relationships with women who I felt safe with that I actually experienced this equality in intimacy.
Yep.
First it helps to know where everything goes, so we know where everything went. Also, it was really organic and certainly helped me explore not just sexuality itself, but positivity in sexuality.
Yeah, of course.
And feeling like I had a right actually to it's not necessarily with words. I think obviously intimacy is its own language, but to communicate in those intimate moments, what my needs are or what my desires are, and how to share that.
Yeah.
Again, in an equal negotiation.
Can I come back to my odd two-part question before and go back to part A of the question, which was your experience of autism. And I just, I've never done a two-part question before and given the guest the choice of which. Anyway, how do you describe autism to someone who doesn't have much knowledge around it?
Oh, swift jump there.
There was no edit there.
Yeah, it was just sexy time, scissoring, autism. Go. How's my experience of autism? I have no filter.
Oh my God. That's one of the best things anyone's ever said on this podcast. I'm
trying to work out why you're looking at me strangely as I asked that question. Yeah. And I'm so enthralled in every word you're saying, but the word autism is just on top of mind for me, and I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
No, please don't apologise.
It was such an abrupt change of direction. And
it provided one of the greatest moments of the show, so.
I'm so sorry. I would love. Now, what you've also done is meant we can't edit this bit out now where I did answer to a question. So.
That is going in the Daily Mail. Sorry, guys. I don't know if you've ever been featured in the Daily Mail yet.
Not yet.
Thankfully
There's
not.
a first time for everything.
In response to a buffoon's question.
I think they use stronger language than buffoon in the Daily Mail, from what I understand.
Yeah.
Dear.
Yes.
Okay.
How would I explain autism?
Yeah, I would love to hear your take on it. It's a bit clumsy, but your experience of it and how you'd explain it to people.
I'll do my best to define it in the way that I understand it, because different people have different interpretations of what autism actually is. But scientifically speaking, it is a different neurotype. So it's a differently wired brain that results in a different sensory way of both receiving and communicating information. So, for example, I process light differently. I hear sounds differently. I experience physical touch differently to the predominant neurotype. Every autistic person, every autistic individual has a different sensory profile. That means that they will also experience those senses differently and communicate differently. That's why they say no two autistic people are the same. The autism spectrum refers to the intensity of autistic traits and needs that fall into each of those different sensory categories.
And
I hope I'm not graded on this, by the way, by any autism experts listening.
And okay, so understanding that, does being autistic make you a more likely target for all we've talked about today?
Statistically, yes. Again, all autistic people have a different experience of autism, but it is a common autistic experience to struggle with understanding subtext. So if we think about the experience of grooming, there's an increased vulnerability to that psychological manipulation. Max was reading a book a couple of years ago about autism, and he stopped very abruptly one day and turned to me and said, I think that he used the offender's name. I won't use his name. But he essentially said that he thinks the offender who abused me had picked up on the fact that I was autistic and weaponized that.
I guess it could something that it's going to me that it's doubly. There's two forms in which it could happen. In that, yes, the profile that you just described is a way in, but also that for a lot of the way the world is set up is not designed for neurodiverse people. So neurodiverse people automatically, I shouldn't say all, but in a lot of cases will therefore be in more vulnerable situations because the world in which they're living is not set up for their way of thinking.
That's correct.
There's those two layers of in my mind, I'm imagining that there are 2 points at which the risk factor is increased.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Because the average neurodivergent person is having to overextend and in many ways suppress their needs that often can't be serviced because it's just not possible, or certain accommodations haven't been offered in a particular environment. So that means they're, constantly tired and not functioning optimally, which they could be doing if their needs were met.
Yeah.
And it's actually really simple things. Like, for example, I can't filter out background noise and I'm really sensitive to humming sounds. So like any kind of motor or anything like that, like I can hear fridges.
I was just going to say, my fridge was humming crazily the other day and that would have driven you insane.
Yeah, I can hear them.
Yeah.
And in a really invasive way. The volume of the fridge is I would hear it at a higher volume than a neurotypical person. And so, if I were to request, hey, can we just turn this down or we do this, or really bright lights I struggle with. I'm really sensitive to light. And you guys made the accommodation of dimming the lights, which is amazing. It was you who actually suggested it. And often autistic people are also not actually thinking to ask for their needs because they're just already anticipating that there's no possibility of...
It's not set up for them in that way.
Yeah, so we'll just often cope to our detriment.
So when I messaged you this morning and said, I so awkwardly wrote this message saying, would when we see each other, would you prefer to hug or handshake or wave or whatever? As I sent it, I was like, I'm so scared this is going to come across as patronising, but that's an important thing to do. Is that?
Oh, it's like, I know that you're operating in good faith and so am I. I don't think that you think I'm like that I have special needs or something like that. I just thought that was really nice of you to ask because no one usually asks.
Yeah.
I'm not used to people asking. Yeah.
We have talked so much about the challenges that you've faced in your life today, and it has been such a privilege to share this space with you today. I speak on behalf of everyone in the room, not just Josh, Ryan and myself, but George and Bridget as well.
You.
I want to talk about recovery, because you sit in a space where you have for the last however many years now been able to talk about this in a way that I cannot even begin to imagine how many people's lives you have helped and how many lives you have saved. I guess I'm asking about recovery. What do you do to aid your recovery, and how do you, when you look at it, what are the things that help you to recover?
It's easier said than done, because I think that, especially when you have such a disruptive experience in childhood, and I know this to be true of so many other survivors of child sexual abuse, it's not as simple as having a goal of recovery, because it does, at the biological level, leave an imprint. And, that's why you'll often see people who have had some of their growth interrupted at the crucial phase of development trying to reset their reward pathways in maladaptive ways by, gambling or drinking or smoking or doing something that isn't necessarily healthy but provides some momentary relief. And so there've been times in my life when I've done things like that. But I almost see that as part of the recovery, like a clumsy part of the recovery. But I think when we share, we heal, to quote Grace Tame.
From the Grace Tame Foundation.
5th of January 2021. And that can look different for different people as well. It might just be sharing an experience and having some implicit understanding. That's why running's really great. I wrote recently in an essay that, and I think it was my friend Ariel who said it originally, but that the silent miles are often the most binding, because you are just implicitly sort of sharing this challenge, and that your bond, your unspoken bond is growing from that. And other meaningful values I try to stay connected with, is try to spend as much time as I can with my family and, read as opposed to scroll online. But like I said, it's easier said than done. Sometimes I'm having to fight myself physically because I have almost obsessive or addictive tendencies that are drawing me towards a certain activity that will give me short-term relief, but it isn't necessarily good in the long run. So it's a push-pull process that is totally non-linear. I think one of the big differences, though, between myself now and myself at earlier epochs is that I have a lot more compassion for those times where I'm really struggling to fight that particular urge, and maybe I just give in and sit down and, I don't know, like watch a movie that I've seen 100 times because it gives me comfort as an autistic person to engage in repetitive behaviours, And if I need to do nothing for half an hour or an hour or maybe even a whole afternoon, I'll allow myself to do that and not indulge the part of me that thinks that I need to be productive all the time, because actually rest is really productive.
Grace, this has been the most amazing interview in Baroque. It's one that we will never forget. Hard to like Australian of the Year just isn't enough. It needs you deserve
It's
it.
enough. It's enough, Hugh. You want to go, Hugh? You want Andrew Bolt breathing down your neck? No.
We just adore you. We love you, and thank you for spending this time with us today. It's been
Thank you for
incredibly
having me.
special.
Thank you.